This dome on the top of St Thomas's in Old Portsmouth has been my studio and thinking space for the Hermitage Artist Residency. This Cathedral of the Sea overlooks the mouth of Portsmouth Harbour, a gateway to the Solent, to Europe and to international waters. The Soup of Souls is a collection of 8 drawings which, if you put them together, creates a dome shape. The dome shape is inspired by the Artist Residency in the studio above the belfry of Portsmouth Cathedral, where I've been artist in residence for the last 5 months, working on the theme of time with the Cathedral and the Arts Council England. The 4 drawings in the centre of the room, facing inwards, pick up on some of the larger, more historic stories associated with Portsmouth. We have the national treasure of the Mary Rose, which we look into the picture, and the top of the composition we see the boat itself, the ship, and we have a circle of seagulls that blend themselves into fish, go past the fiddler who's playing a Tudor violin, and down to the composition at the bottom where we have the namesake of the Virgin Mary, who I've morphed into the shape of the shipwreck. And if we look along the bottom of the picture, we can see a memento mori dedicated to the personal belongings and trying to tell a personal story of the character in the centre of the picture. The other panel we have is one dedicated to the burials at sea, a tradition and ceremony across cultures in the world where bodies are laid to rest, dropped from boats, slipped into the sea and laid to rest at the bottom. In this composition we have ships associated with Portsmouth, the HMS Elizabeth, the new aircraft carrier, we have the Victory, we have the Mary Rose and the Vanguard battleship as well. In the middle of the composition we have a solitary figure who is suspended on his way down to the bottom of the sea with a shoal of fish creating angel-like wings and a halo created by the sailor's hat. The bottom of the composition we have a reference to Britannia, a sleeping figure draped in the flag, and we have 2 seals, a sea lion and a common harbour seal, referencing not just the important symbolism of the ceremonies, but also just the common burials which we'll have. The 3rd panel we have of the SS Mende tells a tragic story of 646 men who drowned within a few minutes in the cold waters just off of the Isle of Wight in 1917. It's a wonderful story of courage and of culture, where we have a ship of 823 men who have travelled on the steamship across the west coast of Africa to Europe, and as they got to the Isle of Wight they were hit by another steamship, the SS Darrow, and 646 of the men drowned. 607 of these men were from the South African National Labour Corps, and these men were destined for the battlefields of the First World War to tidy up the battlefields and provide hard labour. And if we look at the composition along the bottom of the picture, we can see there are no weapons in this battlefield, there are only the tools of hard labour: shovels, picks, spades and forks. And if we look closely amongst the skulls, we can see the debris of warfare, the helmets, the hats, and in the right hand side we see the ship's bell itself from the SS Mende. As we look through this composition, we can see the dolphin which has scorched this warrior down to the bottom of the sea, both as a spiritual guide but also a reference to the culture and to the character who is suspended above in his traditional ceremonial clothing. As we look through the composition from the top, we have the ship, the SS Mende, travelling through a vortex of seagulls, diving into the sea and following this warrior down to the bottom of the seabed. The warrior himself mimics the shape of the dolphin, and we see the shield which he's holding, which is derived from tradition of African masks, which suggests ancestry and family and all of the people that are left behind. One finds it hard to consider the difference between a quick death at sea or years spent labouring, tidying up the mess of the battlefields of Europe. In this drawing, I picked up on a story of two aeroplanes, a Hurricane and a Messerschmitt from World War II. Two young men flying fast and furious in the heavens suddenly collided, and their fate entwined together as they too go to the bottom of the sea, to a graveyard depicted in this drawing as a memento mori of aeroplane wings, tails and skulls and propellers, all making up a graveyard-like scene in which we find octopuses representing propellers or mimicking the shape of the propellers. We see the skulls of the two pilots, and above them in the centre of the drawing we have the two pilots themselves, one in an RAF uniform and one in a Luftwaffe uniform. Just above them, if we look closely into the composition, we can see the jellyfish mimicking a parachute, and if we go back above we can see a reference to the Isle of Wight with the needles and the lighthouse which shines across. We even have a small suggestion there of Palmerston's Folly, and into the sky we have a halo of seagulls, something which I've used throughout the drawings to reference a gateway to the other world. The drawings on the outside of the nave depict more personal stories, and starting with They Lost, we look at some of the more tragic and the sadder versions of loss at sea. Here, if we look into the harbour's mouth, we see references to the local architecture, the spinnaker, the lipstick tower, and of course we have the artist's studio itself, the Cathedral of the Sea, St Thomas's. And on the left-hand side, we have the almost ironic reference to the water tower, which inverts the story as a column of water used for training divers and sailors at sea. Below the composition, as we go down to the bottom of the sea, we have an ageless, androgynous kind of figure representing a lost soul. The wings of an angel are suggested with a shoal of fish, accompanied by two benevolent creatures, the dolphins, so closely associated both with Gosport and Portsmouth. At the bottom, along the memento mori, we have a skeleton with a raised hand offering up. We're not quite sure if we're looking at somebody waving or drowning at this stage, but surrounded by message in bottles. We have letters, we have books, we have telephones, we have skulls, we have things which make us think about all of the messages, the hints, the conversations that we've missed. And in this particular theme of suicide, we have to look along the south coast to find some of the sad stories of people who were lost at sea, but perhaps beforehand were already lost on land. In this panel, dedicated to swimming, I'm asking people to look at Southsea not just as a place of leisure and association of going to the beach in our summer holidays, but thinking of the dangerous currents and thinking of some of the sad stories which have resulted from our holiday experiences on Southsea seafront. This composition starts at the top, and you have the seagulls each flying in different directions, asking the viewer to pick up the movement of the swimmer below. As we go through the surface of the water, we head through this figure that represents the sad story of a local man called Marco, a young Portuguese man who drowned in saving the lives of two young children at the Hot Walls in Old Portsmouth. If you look along the bottom of the drawing, you can see the memento mori here is a direct and more perhaps literal reference to the theme of time. We all associate sandcastles with time. We know that they pass with the tide. But to the left we have the reference, perhaps a new reference to time, that of plastic, where we're asked to think in terms of thousands of years. And on the right-hand side we have another reference to time, the sand timer, which is used also in the composition for the Mary Rose drawing, an artefact found at the bottom of the sea. We also, in this particular panel, have a fairly modern reference to the Cold War stories of Portsmouth as a military town. We have the dark figure hidden in the shadows of Buster Crabbe, Portsmouth's very own James Bond. He was sent down into the harbour in his frog suit to spy on a Russian ship, to check the size and shape of a propeller. He didn't return from this mission, and his body was given back by the sea a month later, decapitated with his hands chopped off. Another panel on the outside of the nave picks up on the popular phrase, "they fell into the water." When we hear this phrase, we think of the polite way of describing either something which is slapstick, something which may have been a funny event, but in this particular panel, I'm looking at the sadder and darker versions of this. People who have drowned or fell from their boat, people who have perhaps given themselves or found themselves at the bottom of the sea. If we look at the top of the composition, we see a number of figures guided into the sea. They rest upon the wings of a seagull, and this is inspired by my love of the story that every seagull is the soul of a sailor. This theme runs throughout most of my work, and in particular in this panel, we see a portal opening on the surface of the water as we go down through to the shape of a boat, perhaps it's a coffin, and a curled figure, a fetial-like figure, who's curled up in the dive bomb position, which those locals who have ever seen the young men diving and jumping off of the hot walls would recognise this, and the sad stories that have not only resulted in death, but long-term paralysis. On the left, we touch upon another local story of a 14-year-old boy, Simon, who, after a visit to Gosport to visit some girls, had come back with his friend on a rowing boat, having missed the last ferry. The boat sank and unfortunately took Simon to the bottom of the Solent. If you look into the memento mori at the bottom of the panel, you will see his particular reference both to his friend and to himself and his brother who remembers him, with his coral necklace and the reference to the fish below as his brother, forever in remembrance of the loss of his dear brother Simon. On the right-hand side, we see a reference to land and home with the bricks. And as we look into the darker shadows, we see a figure on the right of a young lady holding a young baby whose hands are clasped around her mouth. A gesture we'll all be familiar with, perhaps as parents, and a gesture used in this context, which suggests some of the sadder stories of well-being and mental health and the things which have led to the poor souls at the bottom of the sea. In this panel, we pick up on a very contemporary history, something which touched the hearts of local people to this very day. The story of the Wilhemina J, a scallop fishing boat, based just around the corner from the cathedral, has inspired this composition, not only as a portrait of the ship itself and the 6 young men who lost their lives after their ship collided with a Cypriot tanker, taking all hands down with it. The fishing community of Portsmouth, based at the Camber docks, is an ancient tradition of bringing food not just to our local restaurants and shops, but across the country and into Europe. It's a tradition which is slowly fading, and something I wanted to pick up on in this particular drawing. In the composition, we see a fisherman suspended, held underwater by 2 creatures, a mermaid man, and a selkie, half seal and half woman, both from sea folklore, one representing the desires and passions of fishermen, and the other perhaps more Neptune-like in the god and rules of the sea. We look at the shell below. Perhaps it's a coffin, perhaps it's a boat. In art history, perhaps a reference to Botticelli's Venus, the shell, the birth of Venus, and perhaps a reference to those that come from the sea and return to the sea. Again, in the bottom right-hand corner, we see the ship's bell, and another reference to the spirit of the ship, something which throughout this soup of souls has returned again and again as a metaphor, not just for those lost, but for those remembering and those in grief for those lost.